Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. Today we'll be reading from the story of Tibet, where His Holiness the Dalai Lama talks about Milarepa. I have a printout of Milarepa. It took so much ink. I'll show you guys right now. This is Milarepa, Saint Milarepa. I pasted it in this folder, so it's like easy to carry around. Page 88 from the Story of Tibet. When the Dalai Lama spoke of Milarepa's death, the issue of levels of interpretation presented itself once again. When Marpa mistreated Milarepa, it was at the second level, the actions of a wise man and for Milarepa's own good. Similarly, when Milarepa died, his biography asserts that rainbows appeared in the sky, flowers fell from the heaven, and the dead saint appeared to the people, at the same time in locations widely separated. He even appeared alive and well to one disciple hours after he had died, reminiscent of Christ's appearance to his disciple after his death. By now, I know what the Dalai Lama would say about these miracles. He had no doubt, particularly with Milarepa, about the authenticity of these events. They were real to people who had developed a higher consciousness through meditation, though a person with what the Dalai Lama called a common mind would not have seen things the same way. We had been talking for quite a while about Milarepa when the Dalai Lama looked at me curiously. But how are these things connected to Tibetan history? He asked. Milarepa is one of the great heroes of Tibetan history, I replied. What is Tibet? Is Milarepa a good example of who the Tibetans are? Yes, true, he admitted. The things you tell us about Milarepa also tell us about the heart of Tibet, don't they? Yes, that is right. Some Tibetan consonants on the wall. Milarepa is Tibet. For outsiders, a monk meditating in a Himalayan cave is perhaps the most cliched of metaphors of Tibet. At the same time, Milarepa is one of Tibet's most revered saints. The ideals he lived for, the ideals that motivated him, his years in caves, the struggles he had under Marpa, these acts of Milarepa's life are definitions of Tibet as Tibetans themselves know the culture, and as outsiders would come to see Tibet. To hear the Dalai Lama talk about Atisha and then Milarepa together was strange. Both are his heroes, yet they are conventionally very different. Atisha helped establish Vinaya, the code requiring monks to wear a prescribed maroon robe and to refrain from drinking alcohol and having sex, among other strictures. He was also a great scholar who wrote books and translated them. Only after long scholastic preparation, Atisha felt, could the instant methods favored by Milarepa lead to enlightenment. Yet Marpa, Milarepa's teacher, was renowned for drinking quantities of beer and engaging in tantric yoga with women. Though Milarepa was celibate, both he and his teacher Marpa are famous for reaching advanced states of consciousness, even those in which humans can perform miracles through intense meditation. Milarepa rejected monastic debates and academia, saying rigorous meditation was the way to enlightenment. Milarepa captured the essence, the emptiness. He hit the real essence without much scholarly study, the Dalai Lama said. So because of that, the followers of Milarepa emphasized direct practice and meditation. The Dalai Lama's praise for Milarepa and Atisha highlights the coexistence in Tibet between Buddhism's two apparently contradictory paths to enlightenment: wild meditating yogis and formal scholastic monks. The seeming disagreement is about means, not the goal. Tibet is the only nation to preserve teachings from all the Buddhist schools of thought up to today. The Dalai Lama, like many Tibetans, has respect for many schools of Buddhist thought. Atisha and Milarepa took different paths to the same goal, and Tibetan history was shaped by a unique respect for and synthesis of both yogic and scholastic forms of Buddhism. Milarepa's primary disciple, Gampopa, codified Milarepa's teaching into a fine-crafted scholastic text still used today. The jewel ornament of liberation helped to preserve the teachings of the yogi Milarepa in a book that is often compared to Atisha's Guide to the Stages on the Path, Lamp for the Path to Enlightenment. As Buddhism was reestablished by different teachers during the second spreading of the Dharma, the return of monastic Buddhism after the chaos that followed Long Dharma, he was like an anti-Buddhist king, many varieties of religious expression emerged. There were solitary monks in caves, some beyond Vinaya and some strictly following it, the codes of monasticism, Vinaya. There were many hundreds of celibate monks living in one monastery whose lives were focused on translating Indian texts. There were a dozen students, all married, gathered around one charismatic teacher who believed that tantric yoga could lead to enlightenment in one life. There was no central figure in Tibet to establish and enforce a strict set of religious guidelines. Monks and other Buddhists at first debated and celebrated the manifest differences among sects. This religious diversity and freedom created one of the richest spiritual chapters in human history, which Westerners became aware of only after the 1960s, when translations of basic Tibetan works like the 100,000 Songs of Milarepa began to appear. These were always different levels of meaning within Tibetan Buddhism, or what the Dalai Lama has described as the common and uncommon perception, depending on one's level of mental training. Tibetan masters knew that true seekers must rely on meaning, not words, on the true doctrine, not men, and on gnosis, knowledge of spiritual mysteries, not perception. They left room for both levels, realizing that individuals differ in their level of spiritual capacity. It was in this climate that Nyingma teachers discovered esoteric Buddhist texts similar to tantric works from India that had been hidden by Padmasambhava during the imperial period. While historians know that these texts were later inventions, faithful Tibetans believe that tirtones or treasure finders found these texts. At the same time, Nyingma teachers preserved and transmitted one of the deepest of Tibet's meditation practices, Dzogchen, which incorporates aspects of Chinese Chan practices, elements that were transformed in Japan to Zen. Every school in Tibet, new and old, preserved many forms of Buddhist practice, from thoroughly ritualistic to advanced meditation practices. Each monastery tended to be independent of central control, and there were many suborders and divisions. At one point, there were more than 12 Kagyu schools of Buddhism. Tibet is so large and the monasteries were so widely separated that there was little central administration. Every Nyingma monastery guarded its independence, for example. Along with the Nyingma, Atisha's Kadam, the Gelug order, would not emerge from the Kadam until the 15th century, and Marpa's Kagyu, another major sect, emerged during the 11th century. The Sakya, those of the gray earth, was named after the clay found around the main Sakya temple. Sakya devotees splashed the adobe walls of their homes and temples with this color. The Sakyapa, like the Gagyupa, traced their foundation to teachings of a charismatic Tibetan teacher. For the Sakyapa, it was Drogmi, a mystical wonder worker who studied the Tantras in India. On his return to Tibet, he attracted a group of devotees who codified his teachings after his death. Drogmi is famous for acquiring a secret teaching that made use of tantric practices for mystical realization. A disciple of Drogmi from a wealthy and powerful background, the Kön family of Sakya founded the first Sakya monastery in 1073. The Sakya eventually became the first of Tibet's Buddhist schools to achieve political power over the country in the 13th century with the backing of a Mongol patron, but during the 11th century it was just one of the many emerging orders. By the late 11th century, the founders of all the four sects were dead and their disciples had codified their teachings. All four sects attracted patrons from powerful regional lords. As the monasteries grew in size, wealth, and in administrative complexity, there was a price: compromised ideals. To cite a typical example, a modest grass hut built by one of Milarepa's spiritual descendants was enshrined within a massive monastic city built by a wealthy family who supported the Kagyu. Spiritual principles and austerity gave way to pomp and ritual. From the monasteries, branch institutions were seeded, and within a few decades, hundreds of monks were living inside the walls of large compounds. The size and number of monasteries increased over the centuries. Statues and murals adorned these places of worship for the growing numbers of monks. Some of the early monasteries housed more than 10,000 monks. In valleys across Tibet, peasants and serfs who had once provided a portion of their harvest or a son in time of war to the lords or emperors who defended their valleys now pay tribute to the local monastery. The annual cycle of rituals to figures like Padmasambhava and Chenrezig grew in number, and the monasteries could not make the required offerings for these rituals without a constant flow of butter and barley from the surrounding farms and nomads. Though some of the monks and nuns, who were a distinct minority, undertook long retreats or engaged in a life of academic study, others came to the monastery, took their vows, learned to read and write, then renounced their vows and left to take a spouse. Among monks who took degrees, some studied philosophy, psychology, and logic, while others translated and collated the Buddhist teachings from India. Still others studied medicine, painting, rituals, and astrology, or devoted themselves to carving the woodblocks to print the collected translation of the Buddha's teachings. Many monks earned a peaceful living Many monks earned a living by performing ceremonies for the dead in the homes of the faithful. The walled monastic forts housed not only monks. They became primary schools and universities, hospitals, medical schools, drugstores, temples, museums, printing presses, libraries, crematoriums, banks, old age homes, orphanages, and even on occasion barracks for monk warriors. Monasteries became one public institution, replacing all others, just as they became one of the main political powers, curtailing the development of nationalism. By the 20th century, experts believe between 20 and 30% of the population were monks, and most of them did not perform long meditation retreats. Speaking of one large monastery he knew of, the Dalai Lama said that it had in his day about 8,000 monks, students, and scholars. And I think that out of the 7 or 8,000 monks, if we count the true scholars, including teachers, only about 3 or 4,000 were good monks. So half were rubbish. This is His Holiness the Dalai Lama criticizing some of the large monasteries. Discussing the tendency over the centuries for monks to spend more time focused on rituals, I noted, it seems that all the sects developed rituals and that more and more monks spent their time doing these rituals rather than real meditation. Rituals, he laughed. All the sects have a lot of rituals. There is nothing wrong with ritual. Everyone can perform rituals, but not everyone can do the real practices. So for those who cannot meditate deeply, then their only way is through ritual. They stick to these easier sort of things. Through ritual, there can be contemplation, but without a proper understanding, yes, there can be excesses, which is sad. Nevertheless, popular devotion increased, and as more and more devotees made offerings in temples and monasteries, the monks grew wealthier. This historic process had began in the 11th century with the foundation of the first sects by idealistic Buddhist teachers. As the monasteries became regional powerhouses, feuds and wars between the orders centered on politics and economics rather than on any religious differences. There were a few saints whose concerns transcended politics and money. Some addressed the problems caused by the lack of central state. One saint tried to protect travelers from the highwaymen who made Tibet's roads unsafe, while another founded hospices to tend to the sick. Such saints were the minority, however, and the monastic establishments cared more for their own power despite the price the Tibetan people and Tibetan nationalism paid for the lack of central government. After Langdharma's destruction of Buddhism, the Dalai Lama said, it was the monastic institutions and traditions and powers that grew back. There was no central political power. All the attention of each regent or monk was focused on his own area and on his own school or tradition. So they did not look out for the whole of Tibet. Also, I think the geography had some impact. Tibet is a huge area, and if it had been a small country, it would have been easier to control from the center, but it is huge. In this situation, there was a negative impact from too much devotion to religion. The monks considered the Tibetan nation as secondary to their school, and political things were secondary to the Dharma. Then, worst of all, the Dalai Lama continued, as I said before, it was not true religion they were concerned with. They were concerned to make things big and grand, to make big monasteries and big statues. From about the year 1000 until about 1200, as Tibetans established the great monasteries of Tibet, they continued to travel to India to acquire new teachings. Tibetan monks translated thousands of Indian Buddhist texts, but as Buddhism evolved in Tibet, there was less reason to travel to India. The most important texts were in Tibetan, and teachers in Tibet were numerous. Yet it came as a shock early in the 13th century when the invading Muslims destroyed Atisha's monastery in eastern India. The Muslims had led annual campaigns out of what are now Afghanistan and Pakistan, fighting their way through the Gangetic Plain from west to east for 200 years. The Buddhist statues appalled the iconoclastic Muslims. The Muslims reached Vikramashila, the great monastery left intact. At Vikramashila, the Muslims slaughtered the monks. The libraries burned for days. The attackers shattered the statues and stole the gold and jewels that adorned them. The army demolished every building down to the last stone in the foundations of the dozens of temples that once towered in the morning mists. They uprooted them and threw them in the Ganges River. The destruction of Vikramashila was complete. The site has never been identified. This image of the destruction of Buddhism in India, the irony of its disappearance from the land of its birth, had haunted me for decades. I was eager to discuss with the Dalai Lama how Buddhism died in its homeland. How was Buddhism destroyed in India? I asked. Was it just the Muslim attacks? Nothing is caused by one factor, the Dalai Lama began. One good scholar who has now passed away sent me a book that he wrote where he discussed the three causes of the decline of Buddhism in India. First, the patrons of the monasteries developed more of an inclination toward non-Buddhist traditions. Second, external forces like the Muslim invasions and others, these forces tried to destroy Buddhism. Third, the monasteries and the monks themselves became very wealthy, and they accumulated a lot of gold in the name of Tantra. As we have discussed, there was drinking and sex. These things happened, so the public lost their respect for the monks, some despised the monks or lost their trust. So I think that there was not one cause, but many. I was surprised to hear him blame Buddhists for these events. I had always held the Muslims responsible. Really? You do not blame the Muslims? I think in the Tibetan case also, just as with the Indian case, there's a tendency to look at the external causes. The tendency to look at external forces first is deeply rooted in the human mind and difficult to eliminate. We cannot do so much about others, about external forces, but then ourselves, if we do not practice well, if we are not disciplined, then our religion becomes hypocritical. This is real. So this is the real history of Buddhism in Tibet and India. I was shocked to see that in every case, the Dalai Lama looked first for his own faults before he would look for faults in others. He looked first for the faults of Buddhism before he looked for the faults of other religions. He looked first for the faults in Tibet and then for the faults in other countries. His inclinations shaped the way he sees history, just as it does for all of us. But with him, his inclination was to see the faults of himself, his nation, and his religion first. I had known intellectually that this is one of the vows of a bodhisattva. Listening to him describe the destruction of Buddhism in India as the fault of the Buddhists, at least in part, brought the knowledge to life in a way that was acutely painful. I knew he was right, but I had never met anyone who gave more than lip service to this ideal. The tendency to look at external forces first is deeply rooted in the human mind and difficult to eliminate. I should not have been surprised when a conversation with the Dalai Lama about the history of Tibet led to something more universal than just the study of one country, but I was. The more time I spent with him, the more he surprised me in ways I was not prepared for. There was nothing vague about his spirituality. It was practical advice. Long live His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And please join us on live stream for Mahakal practice empowerment from Miklotganj, Dharamshala, India in a few days. Take care. It was a request from Kalu Rinpoche, and I'm sure it will be very interesting. And you can subscribe to the Dalai Lama archive channel. Usually they have an English translation simultaneously for those who don't speak Tibetan like me.